I'm David Verrill. I'm the Executive Director of the Initiative on the Digital Economy, one of your 3 co-hosts for today. The faculty and researchers and fellows of the IDE are well represented on our agenda today, including Erik Brynjolfsson, Andy McAfee, Sandy Pentland, Jeff Parker, Neil Thompson, and Tom Davenport, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the content that they'll be providing for the day. I'm going to do a public service announcement on behalf of the IDE, so bear with me for a few moments while I tell you a little bit about what we do. The IDE explores how people and businesses work, interact, and prosper in the digital age. We vigorously examine and solve the opportunities and challenges posed by the digital economy. We do that with 5 primary activities. In the fall, we teach an analytics course called the A-Lab. It's a way that our corporate members can give us business issues and data for master's level students to do a fall semester project on. If you're interested in that, I'd love to speak with you. As we are sponsoring today, we also have a number of events throughout the year. We host digital fellows. Tom Davenport, one of our speakers today, is a digital fellow. And we divide our research into 4 primary areas. They include productivity, employment, and inequality, big data and information privacy, new digital business models, and social analytics and digital experimentation. We have at any given time 36 projects going on. About a quarter of those are supported by industry and are very applied to some of the things that they care about the most. We have a very interesting meeting in the summer is called the Platform Strategy Summit. 2 of our faculty members, Jeff Parker and Marshall Van Alstyne at BU, literally wrote the book on platform strategies. If you're interested in attending any of these events, it would be great to have you join us. They range from the future of work to digital experimentation, analytics, platform strategies, and our annual conference, which is tomorrow. A very important part of what the IDE does has really nothing to do with primary research. It's with making a difference on the ground. We have a grassroots activity called the Inclusive Innovation Challenge. Each year we give more than $1.5 million away to organizations, usually young organizations, for-profit and not-for-profit, who are using technology to improve the opportunity of generating work, particularly for the underprivileged. Right now, we're in the process of having organizations around the world register for that. We have nearly 2,000 organizations. In each of 5 regions, we'll choose winners in each of 4 categories, and we'll invite the winners of each of those regions to a grand finale where we'll give out $1 million on November 21st to companies that are using technology to enable work of the future. That's our grassroots activity. We're very proud of it. And we've got a great team that's been running that for the last couple of years. If you're interested in learning more as a corporate member, my colleague Christy Coe is here somewhere. There she is over there. Christy runs our corporate program, and either of us would be more than happy to speak with you about that. We have a number of organizations, many of you in the crowd today, and some of you sponsors of this particular event that we work with, including Accenture and Deutsche Bank, who are our primary sponsors. We also have the generous support from a number of private foundations and generous individuals. So, on to our Fireside Chat. Let me introduce Erik Brynjolfsson, who's the director of the IDE, a professor at the Sloan School of Management, a preeminent thought leader on the impact of technology on people, business, the economy, and society. And Erik will interview John Gruber and Simon Johnson about their new book, Jumpstarting in America, and our subtitle is, Have We Lost Our Technology Mojo Here in the US? So please welcome Erik Brynjolfsson.
Thank you, David.
Cheers.
Thank you, David, and thank you to all the organizers for this amazing conference. This is always a real highlight of the year for me. It's a great way to bring together so many smart people from MIT and from industry, and for all of you. And so actually I want to congratulate all of you for being part of arguably the most dynamic and technologically innovative industry and profession on planet Earth, you know, maybe in history. So that's good news. Go back maybe 50 years to the founding of Moore's Law, and there's been remarkable progress that any other industry would envy. Even more recently, the progress in machine learning and artificial intelligence and a lot of other areas are very promising. And that's important because these are really the drivers of growth and living standards for everybody. I got my start working with one of MIT's many Nobel Prize winners, Bob Solow, who got his Nobel Prize for noting that tech progress is really the motor for economic growth in the long run. One of the other MIT Nobel Prize winners, Paul Krugman, has said that while the tech progress that drives productivity isn't everything, in the long run it's almost everything, because it's really what affects the success of nations, businesses, and individual living standards. And even just last year, yet another Nobel Prize winner, Paul Romer, which I have to confess is not an MIT Nobel Prize winner, but he got his Nobel Prize for also noting the power of research, development, and knowledge in empowering economic growth and its fundamental roles. So that's all kind of promising in a way, but the data are very concerning, and I wanted to share some facts that suggest some troubling news, and that's really what our panel is going to try and dive in a little bit more deeply. Productivity growth, despite these progress in Moore's Law and elsewhere, has actually fallen quite a bit. It averaged around 2.8% from 1920 to 1970, but it's been 1.6% since 1970. In fact, it's even slowed down another notch recently. The past decade or so, it's only been 1.3%. I checked the data, and 2018, last year, was in fact spot on 1.3%, so less than half of that earlier average. And although unemployment is quite low right now, over 10% of prime-age American men have just left the labor force entirely. So they're not counted as unemployment or employed. They're just not even working. And most of them are probably even worse off than the people who are, quote, unemployed. Data on new job creation and innovation is also fairly dismal. The firm entry rate, according to Ian Hathaway and Bob Litton, is for firms that are less than 1 year old, has fallen by nearly 1/2. So what's going on here? What is driving these disappointing numbers? And I could rattle off a lot more. But our panelists today that I'm going to have a fireside chat with really have a very intriguing diagnosis, and also I think a very promising prescription for this, and a way to, as the book title says, jumpstart America. So we're going to hear from them. But before I bring them out on the stage, I want to ask you to please go to Slido and go ahead and answer 3 poll questions, and we'll discuss those during the session. So if you go to the Slido app or the website, I think you know that to go to hashtag MITCIO, and this session at 11 o'clock, you'll see there are 3 questions that you can answer. Also, I want this to be interactive. I have some questions for these guys, but I also want you guys all to add your own questions, and we'll bring those up. You can, as you know, you can vote, and we'll get the best questions up to the top, or at least the most popular questions up to the top. But now let me introduce the 2 amazing co-authors of this. These are 2 of the superstars at MIT. John Gruber is perhaps best known for being the architect of Romneycare here at Massachusetts, and then Obamacare. And if you ask him to explain the difference between Romneycare and Obamacare, he'll explain that in very colorful language that there is no real difference between the 2. He also happens to be a professor in the economics department here, and my son, who took an economics class with him, said he was his favorite economics professor. I don't know how much weight to put on the economics qualifier there, but he is, as you'll see in the panel, a lot of fun. Simon Johnson, I know in ways even better because he's got the office right next to me at MIT. He was the chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. He's written numerous widely cited papers on many topics, but in particular for this panel on the origins of economic growth. So please join me in welcoming John and Simon. Come on out. Great. So let me start by diving a little bit on the topic that I alluded to. Let me put the book here so everyone can see it, which is research and development. And it used to be, well, actually, let me take the broader arc. Actually, for the early part of American history, actually there wasn't much research and development at the federal level. It was less than 1/10 of 1%. But then in the middle of the 20th century, it really took off. Vannevar Bush, an MIT scientist, wrote this classic thought piece called The Endless Frontier about the importance of research and helped bump it up to close to 1%. And then with Sputnik, got up to 2%. But now it's down to, what's the number? About
0.7%.
Now it's down to 0.7%. So it's less than half of what it was. And you make the case that this fall in federal R&D is a big part of some of the dismal productivity growth that we've seen lately. But let's just start with an economics 101 question. Why should the federal government be doing R&D? If something can create value, shouldn't the private sector be doing that?
You know, Eric, it's a great question. I just want to thank you for having us here. And, you know, this is a book about an area about which Simon and I did not know a whole lot going in. And one wonderful thing about being a place like MIT is we could draw on people like Erik to draw on their expertise and
or ask dumb questions.
and ask great questions, and then the book is much stronger for it. So thank you for that. Look, basically, what's nice about this book is there's nothing outside of Econ 101 in it. And Econ 101 says that the private sector will not do as much R&D as should be done, because the private sector does not account for the spillovers of the R&D that it does. The private sector does R&D to maximize its own shareholder value, but not R&D to maximize the social value of what they're discovering. And we can demonstrate this in two ways. One way is research by another of our colleagues, John Van Reenen, which has shown that while the private rate of return to R&D is pretty high, the social rate of return, the total benefit to society, is 2 to 3 times higher. That's an enormous rate of return. But since it's a book, we like to illustrate these things with stories. And my favorite story about this is the story of the discovery of statins. Some of us in this room may be on statins. They're a miraculous drug to treat cholesterol, save hundreds of thousands of lives. The early trials for statins were in the early 1980s when Merck, a US company, and Sankyo, a Japanese company, were racing to discover the first statin. And Sankyo announced that in their trials, Merck found out that in some Sankyo trials, some dogs had developed lesions, and Sankyo shut down their drug trials. Merck went to Sankyo and said, "What's wrong? What happened?" Sankyo said, "We're not going to tell you. You're our competitor. We're not going to help you." Merck offered to pay. Merck offered to go in partnership. Sankyo said, "Forget it. We're not going to tell you." And so Merck shut down their trials as well. 7 years later, some academics got special permission from the FDA to start new trials. Turned out nothing was wrong with the dogs, had nothing to do with the drug. Statins were developed and now save hundreds of thousands of years of life, 100,000 of lives every year, but 7 years after they should have. So there are potentially millions of lives that could have been saved if research was shared. And this is just an example of the kind of spillovers that don't come from when the private sector does research to maximize their own shareholder value.
Okay, so I buy the argument that, you know, private sector looking to maximize their own profits, they're going to invest some in R&D, but they're not going to take into account all the other benefits that other people get, so they won't the optimal amount. So let me just grant, we could argue that more, but I think that like you said, economics 101 is pretty good on that. But then you suggest, so the government should step in. So if I'm a government skeptic, how do I know the government's going to do any better? Are they, you know, what are their incentives? And is there any track record of the government making any better decisions? I've heard about this company called Solyndra that didn't do so well. So tell me, why is that cure any better than the disease?
Well, so that's absolutely the right question, Erik. And of course, for a long time in the United States, there was a great deal of skepticism, including actually at MIT, about whether government should have anything to do with science. And that was the pre-1940 period. The big conceptual breakthrough in World War II was the idea that government could partner with universities and with the private sector, and in that balance of relationships, and including commercialization incentives, that would develop not just that was some of the products that helped win World War II, but also for peaceful use. And we have this well documented in the book experience of the 40s, 50s, and 60s with numerous inventions that came out from the sort of spillovers that John was talking about, and spread throughout the economy. Modern pharmaceuticals, jet engines, digital electronic computers, everything had its origins in that. So the government has an amazing track record.
Can you link those a little bit to the government? I mean, so amazing, no question. And by the way, if you look at the data, those were like some of the best decades ever for productivity growth. So there's sort of a correlation there at least. Can you take it one step further and explain the government role in some of those innovations?
Sure. Well, if you look at digital computers, for example, the government was very heavily involved sponsoring the technology directly. The Whirlwind system, for example, developed at MIT for air defense. They also supported through purchasing and through R&D support, development of semiconductor and transistors, everything that came out of microelectronics. In 1963, very few people bought any microelectronics except the U.S. Army and the missile program.
So they kind of started the whole...
They were a key early customer as well as providing support for R&D. IBM, which became a tremendous world-leading company, made great progress in part through being a government contractor on some of these early systems and developing the software that they then applied for commercial use.
And do you see this as like a widespread pattern, or is those a few outliers?
It's a widespread pattern. So what we do in the book is show historically how widespread the pattern is, from companies like IBM to the development of radar. Remember, the first microwave was called the radar range. Development of radar leading to private sectors.
Don't put your hand in front of a radar.
Exactly, to satellites. All of these things, the satellite industry employs 170,000 people in America. That's really based on government R&D, government contracting.
Fair enough.
IBM, when it was starting to develop computers, the US government paid 50% of its R&D budget and bought all of its semiconductors. When the government contracted with IBM to write the program for its air defense system, at that point in history, the longest program ever written was 50,000 lines of code. The government asked IBM to produce a 1 million line of code program. That was the birth of modern coding. So all this came from the government. Maybe someone in this
room was involved with that.
But the key point is, it's not, you might say, well, that's all interesting history. It's not just history. Let's turn to a modern example, which speaks to both your first question and your second question, which was in the late 1980s. There was a Nobel Prize-winning biologist named Walter Gilbert who won the Nobel Prize for discovering how to map the human gene, what all those letters figured out in your gene. Okay? And he'd also been a successful entrepreneur, starting Biogen, a pretty successful biotech startup. He decided that the future was in mapping the entire human genome. That was a very ambitious task, which was going to take decades. He went to private funders and said, will you help me fund this? He asked for $10 million, and they said no. They said, what's in it for us? Once you map the human genome, everybody knows it. We're not going to make any money off this.
Classic public goods kind of
Fortunately, the federal government established the Human Genome Project, spent $3 billion over 13 years. The result today is the genomics industry in America, which employs 280,000 people at an average wage of $70,000 a year, and in 1 year alone, paid $6 billion in taxes. Twice the 13-year investment put in to create that industry.
Good ROI.
So this is exactly why the private sector, why the government support still to this day matters.
So, but I don't think you guys are free market economists. You don't want the government to do everything. Is there some kind of a line where you could say, okay, this is where we want the government to help out, this is where we want to give it to the private sector? Simon, you talked about these public-private partnerships. I think you added universities into the mix. Thank you. So explain, is there some natural division of labor there?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's clearly about public-private partnership. That's what worked in the past. That was the Vannevar Bush breakthrough, the conceptual breakthrough. And that's what people who led the country and who provided the funding were convinced would work, and that's what proved to work. So government does the basic science. Government is supporting, providing funding for universities and others who are doing the basic science, just like we do through the NIH still, to a considerable degree. Probably we should do a lot more of that. But other parts of the scientific enterprise have rather withered. And the private sector is doing commercialization. The private sector is bringing products to market. The private sector is developing that further. Now, we proposed some tweaks in the public-private partnership, including in how the public sector participates in some of the upside value creation. But it's that basic, you might say, traditional public-private scientific enterprise partnership that we want to reinvigorate.
Gotcha. So there's, and Jonathan, do you agree with your co-author on that? Or?
Absolutely, and look, here's the thing. The idea of this book is to raise questions as well to answer them. You ask a great question, where do you draw the line? We don't necessarily know that we have the right answer, but we know that the line has to be much further in the direction of public R&D.
You want to move it, but...
We know we have to move it. What's the right amount? We suggest $100 billion, which is 0.5% of GDP, which would take us not all the way back to where we were at our peak, but back to where we were in the early 1980s.
Why so modest? Why don't you go all the way to
Once again,
2%?
we don't know what the right answer is. We know we need more basic research, but the other market failure we haven't talked about is the failure of financing. Which is venture capitalists in America are not financing a lot of the dynamic startups we need. They're really, venture capitalists in America are focused on financing, it's called the pay and spray and pay model, where they want to throw a couple $1 million at a bunch of things and hope one of them becomes a new app. but they're not about financing fundamental technological advance that's going to take a long time to move forward and be expensive.
The fundamental stuff has more spillovers, so that's less incentive.
Exactly. So the question
the
is,
applied stuff they can get returns.
Now we have a government program called the SBIR program, which is a $2 billion a year loan program, which is a great track record of success in financing new startups. Is there more of a role the government could play in the financing space? We don't really know for sure, but these are the questions we have to start asking.
Well, so $100 billion, I don't know whether it's a lot or a little. It's a lot for most of us, but in the context of the overall GDP, maybe it's not, what did you say, it's half a percent?
Per year, we propose.
Per year. So, but that still has to be paid for, right? I mean, just like VCs have to pay for things. Where's the money going to come from for?
Actually, Eric, this is once again, I feel like we have to remember to distinguish investment spending by the government from transfer spending by the government.
We don't usually do that.
When we transfer it from an individual to an individual, that has to be paid for, the deficit goes up. When we invest, that pays itself back through economic growth,
like the
leading to higher
genome
tax
example.
revenues. Exactly.
But not the same year.
Not the same year. Over a very, it's deficit increasing initially, but pays itself back. That said, an important part of our proposal has three key parts. One part is more R&D. The second part we'll come to, which is spreading it around the country.
Yeah.
The third part of our proposal is to make sure that the upside is captured, that when we invest in this basic science and the private sector commercialize it and makes money, that the government gets some of that upside. In a world right now, the government's not collecting any taxes on these tech companies right now, okay?
Well,
not collecting nearly as much as it did on traditional companies. Okay, and basically to share the upside, we need new mechanisms. We talk about new mechanisms to share the upside. Some of that upside can be shared in the form of paying back the initial investment.
I want to get into that a little bit more first, but I want to get the audience. You guys have been answering the Slido questions, I hope. So let's go ahead and put the first one up there. The question is, if you had a tech innovation idea, where would you base your startup? Okay, Boston, I guess, yeah, maybe there's a little selection bias here. Or you're just very smart people, I don't know. Austin, Texas, Boulder, Tuscaloosa, not San Francisco and Tuscaloosa, tied, not doing so well right now. So what does that tell you?
Look, one thing that I think is coming through here, and is clearly in the broader discussion, is that we have some established innovation hubs in the United States, and San Francisco Bay Area is obviously one of them. We don't have that many. Perhaps we have 6, 3 on the West Coast, 3 on the East Coast. They are becoming very crowded and congested and expensive, and it is hard to make a startup, to energize a startup, harder now in San Francisco than it was a decade or two ago. A part of our proposal is to recognize that and to encourage the creation of new innovation hubs. We don't see why 6 is the magic number. We do recognize agglomeration matters, so that people want to live where other people like them with similar skills and similar abilities and interests, and they're looking for talented people in this high-tech context. So there isn't necessarily a movement to Tuscaloosa, honestly, yet. But we think Alabama, in our analysis, has got 6 places that are potential next-generation technology hubs. We identify 36 places around the entire country that have potential to do this. If you can jumpstart the places, you've got to have a critical mass, get over the threshold.
Well, the two at the bottom there, Tuscaloosa and San Francisco.
Oh, since I spoke, Tuscaloosa's moved up, I can see.
Moved back down. But they're down near the bottom probably for very different reasons.
Yeah.
Maybe you can talk a little bit, you mentioned agglomeration, and Tuscaloosa is probably not an issue of agglomeration, but why do you think those two are near the bottom of the list?
Well, I think it's very interesting. This list does not reflect, you guys are not representative of where businesses are going and want to go right now.
Yeah.
So another way you can do the survey is Simon asked his MBA classes, how many at Sloan, how many of you want to work somewhere other than the 6 cities on the coast? And 0 raised their hand.
Yeah.
I asked undergraduate audiences, how many of you want to work not on the coast, undergraduates all over the country?
Yeah.
How many work someplace? And almost no one does.
Yeah.
So basically, people want to go there because that's where the high returns are,
Yeah.
but we can't fit any more people there. We can't afford it, and maybe we're starting to see a revolution towards going other places, but it's very hard to jumpstart
actually, you don't see, I mean, the other ones kind of are tech.
They're tech hubs.
Yeah, and Tuscaloosa, on the bottom of the list, is not. But I think part of your story is that there's potential for
There's
places
potential. So what we do is, look, we don't have a skin in the game. You know, I'm from the New York area. It's already tech hubs. Simon's from England. That's not a tech hub. We're already, we don't have any skin in the game. So what we did is we went to the data.
Okay.
We said, tell us where in America is large, at least 100,000 working age population.
Yeah.
Has a well-educated population, at least 25% college educated, and is affordable, has a house price of less than $265,000 a year,
Okay.
which for those of us in Boston is very affordable. Okay, we found 102 places in 36 states with 80 million Americans living in their metro areas. Places from Rochester, New York, where I was just gave a talk, they are very excited to be a technology hub around optics and photonics. The place on our list, many of them are Rust Belt areas like Detroit or Cleveland or Rochester that were tech hubs. Other are places in the South that actually have excellent universities. You take Baton Rouge, Louisiana, LSU's got excellent science departments. Going out west of the Mississippi to Logan, Utah, to Tucson, Arizona. Places that have the potential to have great skilled people, but the truth is if you talk to the VCs, 2/3 of venture capital in America is in 5 cities. The VCs are not going there. So if you want to start a company in Tuscaloosa, good for you, but it's gonna be hard to get the money. And so basically, we wanna make Tuscaloosa a next generation tech hub, we can't just say, let's do it. We need to jumpstart it. We need the federal government. In a way it's done in the past. The federal government has a long history of making places great. We need the federal government take the lead and say, we're going to declare, move here, this is going to be a new tech.
In your book you note that there were these land-grant colleges, and you go back, the federal government created these land-grant colleges. MIT was a land-grant college, believe it or not, and lots of them, of course, are in the Midwest and elsewhere. And economic growth has flourished around those land-grant colleges. And so part of your story is that we could do that again. But walk me through a little bit. There's another argument that, and Simon mentioned the agglomeration, if we want to fund the best research, shouldn't we just send the money to where the best research is being done, where those Nobel Prize winners are? Maybe some places have a knack for that. And are we getting the same return on our R&D dollar if we don't send it to the places that are already doing well?
So we've looked at that, Erik, and we looked at that in part because you pressed us on that question as we write in the book. And perhaps there's a little bit of additional productivity you get by sending the money to the places already established hubs like Boston. But frankly, that effect seems to be dwindling in part because it's so expensive. A lot of the value, you put those federal dollars into Kendall Square, well, the people who own real estate in Kendall Square are going to have some further appreciation.
The rents are skyrocketing.
The rents are already very, very high. And the congestion, the traffic is already extremely difficult, and the schools are an issue and so on. So our point is, and this is absolutely what's in the evidence, that you would get an impressive, almost as good impact on productivity and on what gets created if you develop new tech hubs, and you'll take some of the pressure off San Francisco, off Boston. You'll make a bigger, more dynamic economy by creating more of these innovation
More
hubs.
of the money would go into research and less into landlords. Well, actually, speaking of which, let's get the next question up there. The next question was about San Francisco. Let me see if I get the question here. The number one problem facing business in San Francisco Bay Area, which came close to the bottom of the list here. Well, there you go. So this is what, if you could put it up there. So the rent is too damn high, is exactly what you were saying. So that's one of the reasons maybe it didn't do so well. So that's the reason that you can't just keep cramming more and more stuff into the same space.
We're having this conversation a lot with people working in the technology space, that they are frustrated and they find San Francisco Bay Area to be attractive but also difficult. And so the question is where to go. Well, John gave you a list, but nobody wants to be the first person to go there. People are afraid to leave the hub for good reason, because the hub is where the talent is. Our point is, if we're going to be making a federal push on R&D, which we think you should for pure growth reasons, think strategically about what is actually a big asset of the United States, which is a geographically dispersed, deep pool of talent. Now, some of that talent may need additional training. Back to your point about land-grant colleges, there needs to be an increase in the demand for skilled labor and supply of skilled labor, but this is something that people all around the country want to work on.
Well, and it goes to the title of your book, it's jump-starting it. It's not, the idea is that once you create a new focal point there, then some of that stuff becomes self-perpetuating.
And this is something we really borrow from the economist Enrico Moretti, who's done a great job on this, pointing out America's in the midst of what he calls the Great Divergence. That basically we can complain about the rent, but the truth is companies still go there. We're in this thing because of this problem of agglomeration, the talent seeking talent, that basically the companies still want to go to these places. And they're frustrated that it's expensive, but it's also the places where the most talented people seem to be flocking in large numbers. And so if we want to make it so that Simon's MBAs in his classes say, no, I actually want to go to Columbus, Ohio, we have got to, because people from Columbus, Ohio love living in Columbus, Ohio. I was in Rochester, they're so pro-Rochester. They love living there, they just don't have the jobs. We need to basically make it so that there's a jump start to these places so that they can become the economic centers they're ready to be.
Is there a story of some kind of a market failure or something in that answer?
This is really interesting because this is what we spend a lot of time thinking about. The big question is sort of, why is VC so concentrated? Why is venture capital so concentrated? We've talked to venture capitalists who are starting to spread the wealth and saying there's all these incredible high rate of return opportunities. Steve Case is making a lot of noise about it. He hasn't actually put that much money in it. We've talked to other venture capitalists who are actually putting a lot of money into it.
He hasn't put in $100 billion yet?
No, and basically, but the answer, the answer seems to be that venture capitalists, partly it's a bias. When we are doing this book and we talk to our economist friends, they're like, who wants to live in Cleveland? Why would you, And the answer is, look.
I hope that's not the quote that we get from this
No,
panel.
no, but the point is, it's this bias in particular that the elites have in these cities. Like, we've already made it. We can afford our houses, partly because we bought a long time ago.
Right.
We
You're
like
part of that
living
real
here,
estate rise.
and we benefit from the real estate rise. But in fact, we're in this bubble where, and a lot of the explanation of venture capitalists is the VCs in these places just won't leave their bubble. They're just not comfortable going to other places. We need to break that bubble and get them there.
I think there's a bit of an attitude or a social norm that's developed, Erik, that somehow you can only do certain kind of innovation in some places. We don't see that in terms of when we talk to technical people, when we look at what universities are developing, when we look at where education is. And I think this will change. I think it's an opportunity, actually, for people in this room to think about this as bring the capital to the people, figure out how to develop new places. And you could do that purely private sector. Absolutely. Just give us a credit when you do that, would you? But our point is nobody other than the federal government has a deep enough pocket to move the needle on the macroeconomic scale. We love the philanthropists. Steve Case is a great guy, that's for the record. But no philanthropist has enough money to impact this. Whereas, and state and local governments are also have a lot of very sensible initiatives, not going to move the needle at the national level.
Let me channel, 47 or 50% of the American public and say, we can't afford to be spending more in government. But you have this innovation dividend. You have a way, you mentioned earlier that this can pay for itself. So flesh that out a little bit. How does the innovation dividend work? How do we collect some return on this, and how do we spread that benefit?
So let's say about Kendall Square. So Simon likes to say when he was a student here in the early 1980s, so Kendall Square's right around here, he said you used to have to leave to get mugged. That it was so dead here that the criminals wouldn't even hang out here. Okay? Now, and in fact, at one point, Kendall Square was a snow farm for Boston. The real estate was so unvaluable, they dumped the snow here for the rest of Boston. Now Kendall Square is the most expensive real estate in the country, tied with Midtown Manhattan. Who's benefited from, now why has that happened? In large part through NIH funding that led to new biological insights that led to the biotech growth industry. Has the government benefited from that? Not in large part. In large part, it's the landlords who benefited from that.
Well, the government got the R&D.
But
they didn't get the real estate benefit. Yeah.
So our idea is to say, let's have government ownership of some of this land it's not just agglomeration anymore, it's hyper-agglomeration. It's not just Boston, it's Kendall Square. So when you set up these new technology hubs, let's have the government share in the upside of the real estate value.
Right.
Take that upside and do what Alaska does with the upside of oil revenue. Of the Alaska Permanent Fund, every year takes the extra oil revenue earned in Alaska, puts it in a fund, and pays those returns out as a flat dividend to every Alaska resident.
So if you live in Alaska, you get like $1,000
yeah, between
a year.
$1,000 and $2,000 every year. Doesn't sound like a lot, but that lifts 20,000 Alaskans out of poverty every year. Let's have a technology divivid, an innovation dividend, where the upside goes into a fund, and that's paid as a flat dividend to all Americans.
Well, and the government would be able to make these, because the government in a way has insider knowledge. The government knows that, hey, this is going to become a tech hub because we're going to make it a tech hub. So if they get the real estate in on the ground floor, then they get a return on what they've created. Is that the essence of the story?
This already happened. So for example, Amazon, but in a private sector way, when Amazon was doing its site selection for HQ2, the deals from public sources indicate that when they lined up their deals originally in New York and also in Washington, D.C., or Northern Virginia, they signed the deals for the real estate before they announced where they were going. Of course, because once they announced where they're going, rents go up by 10, 15, 20%. That's pretty normal. That's a market reaction. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's exactly the same mechanism. You want to make sure, but we want some of that upside. It's NIH funding, which is supporting Kendall Square and paying these very high rents. Some of that should be coming back to every American as a cash dividend.
And you know what else? The government has one other advantage. There's a lot of excess federal real estate in America. So you look at Pittsburgh, one of the cities which is sort of it's growing, but it's still not quite at that tech hub level. There's 675,000 square feet of unused or underused federal real estate in Pittsburgh.
You just have all these facts in your head.
And basically, so you look at Kendall Square. What MIT just did was a land swap. They just paid the Department of Transportation to buy a bunch of land in Kendall Square. Department of Transportation got a bunch of money and a new building out of it. So not only does the federal government have the need to do this, we have the wherewithal, and that we own a lot of real estate around we can use for this.
Sounds great. And are there, and then that money, say a little bit more about where the money goes. So it goes to the federal government, but is it nationally distributed, locally distributed? Does it?
Look, once again, there's no right answer here. I mean, I think there's a trade between two approaches. The approach we suggest in the book is that literally it's nationally distributed, because the localities will benefit from the jobs and other activity. We don't think you need to then put extra money to the localities besides the federal government investment. This would go into a fund which you pay as a flat dividend to all Americans, so that if you're not in one of the cities that wins this competition, you can still benefit. So that's just one of the things. The idea here of how this would work, because I think it's important to mention this, is to learn from Amazon. We suggest a competition, but not a destructive competition of the kind that cities engage in to get Amazon, not the kind that leads cities to spend $50 billion a year in tax breaks, which largely just go to companies that would have settled there anyway, but a productive competition where cities compete to be the new tech hub. We suggest between 20 and 30 winners, distinctly more than one, and distinctly less than 50. Because once it's 50, politically every state gets one. You want 20 to 30, spread around the country, but that's not everywhere. So the idea of an innovation dividend is that everyone would see the upside. Now, you could also say we'll take some of that money and pay back the original $100 billion investment. We're not opposed to that. We're just saying you shouldn't be as tied to that because we think tax revenues will pay some of that back.
And this would get a bunch of political buy-in from that. And you're helping to channel it towards some geographies, but also particular technologies. So I think we have one more poll question, if we could put that up. The last one about the technologies: green energy, artificial intelligence, brain science, hydrogen energy, deep sea, and none were doing fine. So it looks like green energy, the Green New Deal, is a big winner here. These are some of the ones that you brought up. To say a little bit more about why which areas you think could benefit from R&D and why you are picking those in particular.
I would say the important point is we are not technology futurists, we're technology optimists. We think there are lots of areas that are going to grow. We did happen to do one cool thing, which is one of the areas not on the list that we think is a great growth area, is synthetic biology, essentially redeveloping genetic material in the laboratory. What's cool is the week our book came out, it was on the cover of The Economist as the growth industry of the future. So in that sense, we're a bit of futurists. Good timing. But basically, we're technology optimists. Everywhere we go, we have great new ideas. So once again, I was in Rochester, photonics. Essentially, in 20 years, we're going to store data on lasers, not on wires.
So there's lots more than this list.
There's lots more than this list.
Well, do you need 20 or 30 of them like you had it? Do you need one for every city?
No, but the point is they don't have to all be different. So green energy is obviously, green energy means lots of things. So for example, in Iowa, they're doing incredible research on adaptive agriculture, which is essentially about how we adapt to climate change. In Baton Rouge, Louisiana, they're doing really exciting research on ocean adaptation to climate change. In other places, they're doing research on solar and wind and other things. So we think green energy is a great time. It's hot right now. And actually, a lot of the folks we're talking to on the left like that as a tie-in for our idea. But we actually would argue to spread it more broadly and to basically use the diversity of options we have in America. But, and one other thing, which is, you mentioned Solyndra, I want to come back to that.
Yeah.
We have to recognize that we have to accept failure. This, to me, is the single biggest political challenge our idea faces.
So you're not expecting a 100% hit rate on
this? No,
this?
if we get 100%, we were too risk averse. In fact, venture capitalists make 70% of their returns on 8% of their investments. We have to fail. We have to have failure. And if we're in a status where one failure, where 95% hit and 5% fail, and we call that a failure, which is where we are today with public investments, it's not going to work. We have to develop a method that recognizes that it's a portfolio of returns that matters.
We're 329 million people in a world of 7 billion, going to 10 billion, going to 12 billion. The problems of the world are enormous. We're the innovation hub of the world. That's our track record. That's what we've done in the past. That's what we can do again. We should tackle every single one of these problems with the potential, actually, exception of artificial intelligence. You and I have been talking about this, Erik.
Yes.
If there's a sector where the private sector is really taking the lead and doing the fundamentals and pushing the breakthroughs, I don't think the government needs to get in their way. If, however, if there are basics that are being missed, if there are things the private sector is not doing, this is right up your street, and we can identify those, yes, make that a priority.
Yes, so most of those came from your book. I added artificial intelligence because I think it's, and also for this audience, and I think the metric I use isn't whether the private sector is putting a lot or a little into it, it's whether or not there are externalities above and beyond. And and I think there are some big externalities, and so whatever amount the private sector is putting in, it isn't going to be the optimal, and according to John's Economics 101 lesson.
Well, and I think, you've plugged our book. Let's plug your book. I'm sure all of you are familiar with Erik's excellent books on the machine age and basically thinking about the role of artificial intelligence in the future. And I think The point is not this isn't a productive area. The point is we need to look at the places where the private sector is not doing the work. And that's what you identify in your book, and what we need to think about. Green energy is easy because the private sector is not doing much of it at all. I mean, in some sense, the whole thing's a giant failure.
Well,
artificial
that is
intelligence
sort of
is more nuanced.
the archetypal market failure is pollution, and so I want to get some of the questions from the audience, and so we're having a discussion here about Economics 101, but the top question from the audience is, and you mentioned this with Solyndra, is that does the current political climate support this? There's been the question says rejection of fact-based decision making, but it's not clear to me when you go to Congress or the administration that the debate is about externalities. It's more probably bare knuckles politics. So is that going to make it impossible to do these in an effective way, or?
No, I don't think so, Erik. I mean, conversations that we've had, admittedly, most of them right now behind closed doors, people on the right and on the left are extremely interested in some version of this. And we wrote the book deliberately so that you could take various technology visions, which may differ across right and left, and you can use the machinery that we propose in terms of ramping up R&D and spreading the benefits around the country. And a lot of people are interested in this more proactive government as a complement and to the private sector. Not government getting in the way of the private sector, but government returning to that role and reinvigorating that role as a complement.
And look, I think that we are optimists in a fundamentally pessimistic time in many ways, and we acknowledge that, but we're also clear-eyed and recognize that this will not work if it becomes a political boondoggle. But once again, what's great about doing historical research is you realize we have great examples to look at. What is one of the hardest decisions the U.S. government ever had to make? Closing military bases. They're incredibly popular local. They provide a lot of jobs. What did the government do? They set up an apolitical device called the Base Realignment and Closing Commission. You guys all remember House of Cards Season 1. That's what he's testifying in front of. Okay, this apolitical device successfully closed more than 300 military bases in America. That's a really hard thing to do, to close a military base.
So you would imagine something similar, some kind of a commission?
We propose a tech hub opening commission.
Okay.
That's in
the
some
flip
sense
side.
easier.
Maybe some of the same military bases.
Maybe that's cheap land that the federal government owns.
Yeah.
And basically, we think we have a track record of doing this, but we want to be honest. We have to be serious about the politics to make this work.
So here's an interesting, I hadn't thought of this, but this is a really interesting question, especially from this audience. A lot of this is about geography and people in particular places. The question is, how do you see remote technologies that enable workers that don't have to physically move to a hub, like virtual hubs, affecting this? Is there a role that geography becomes, a story that geography becomes less relevant?
Look, it's a great question, and this issue has obviously been around for decades. Two main observations. First of all, in the 1970s and 80s, when people imagined virtual technologies beginning to be developed, the thought was precisely that workforce will become more dispersed. Now we see more concentration, and we see companies that have operations in Route 128 moving the workers to Kendall Square because they want to be closer.
It's not ironic. It's almost the opposite of what
But I would say that developing broadband throughout the country and enabling people to connect to urban areas and to tech hubs, that should be an important priority. You don't want to have talent trapped for whatever reason, housing reasons, social reasons, whatever it is. You don't want to have the talent trapped away from where the innovation is taking place. So we want to create more hubs. We want to connect people to those hubs, and anything that makes sense as a pathway to that, we would support.
Yeah, I mean, my take on that is email, et cetera, is even video conference is amazing, but there's still no substitute for face-to-face interactions. And I think the people want to be in San Francisco or Kendall Square or other tech hubs, and maybe these new ones, because they want to be able to be face-to-face with the people.
And the venture capitalists believe this enormously. That's why they're so concentrated in a few places. They want to be where their companies are.
Right. Here's where did it go? Ownership. Yeah, so there are people, I think, especially on the left, that are saying, look, federal government's funding all this research, and then private companies are reaping the profits from it, billions of dollars sometimes. Is that a problem, or is that a feature, or how would you navigate this issue that the R&D often benefits the few rather than the many, at least in the public perception?
Look, this is a feature. This is something which the U.S., as Simon said, our model is the government does the basic research, helps the early development, but the private sector ultimately innovates and creates the jobs. The problem is that our tax system is increasingly collecting less and less of that benefit.
Okay.
So and the companies, now that they're focused more on maximizing shareholder value than they were, say, in the 70s, are sharing less of that benefit with their workers through lifetime contracts and things like that. So essentially the question is, I think if the answer is we have to take away private ownership, that's not the answer.
Okay.
Private ownership is what's going to develop innovation.
What about patents? Do you feel like patents are too strong, about right, too weak? Are they going to help the private sector capture some of the benefits in a good way, or is that more?
We think we need more public sharing of the spillover. So, for example, think about Bell Labs. So we're talking about this just this morning. Bell Labs, under consent decree, had to make all their research public. And that led to an enormous spillover for free. And so one thing we've been talking about is, why don't we do that with Google?
Okay.
You know, in some sense, instead of focusing on breaking Google up, why don't we focus on sharing the research
So the
they have
government would
inside?
force them to do that.
But we want to do that in a way it doesn't deter innovation. That's the balance.
But why wouldn't it deter innovation if you
Well,
take
that's the
away?
balance, because we could share some, but
Okay.
not too much.
So we're almost out of time. I'm going to squeeze in 2 quick questions here. We're just about out of time. The first one is, tell us about any of the potential sites for Opportunity Hubs proposed taking next steps. So do you see some of this already happening? Are there some green shoots where you see this happening? And then I'll give you the second question so you can think about it as well, is any advice or recommendations for the people here, CIOs, tech industry people, that you think they should be doing, other than, of course, reading the book and following the prescriptions in it?
Simon's inspirational advice, so I'll take the first point.
Okay.
We are seeing this in some places. So, and in fact, the point we make in the book is that we're trying to have it both ways. We're not saying invest in areas where nothing's going on. There are lots of areas where the potential is there, where there's green shoots showing, where there's a skilled population. The problem is the oxygen's being sucked out of the room by the superstar cities. We're saying bring some of the oxygen back to these places, let those green shoots grow higher. We're seeing, once again, in Rochester, they have a $100 million investment about $1 billion investment in new photonics laboratories.
And where'd that investment come from?
That investment came from New York State and from the Advanced Manufacturing Institute set up by the Obama administration.
Gotcha.
But it's not of a big enough scale that it's really attracting that it's really getting rid of that giant sucking sound that's being created by these other coastal hubs.
Smart college graduates are moving to,
They even have a name for it. They call it the Rochester diaspora. We're in Detroit yesterday. They call it the Detroit diaspora. People who are from there love it there, but they want to leave to go to these other superstar cities. So Simon will give the advice.
Okay, closing thoughts, Simon.
Look, I think for the private sector, there's an opportunity here, which is to think about helping to develop new innovation hubs. You get in on the ground floor with local government, with universities. You build a coalition. A lot of those coalitions, I mean, to give Amazon some credit, they pushed people to do that in the bidding for HQ2. So think about ways you may be able to also disaggregate the innovation process. Perhaps you do need to leave some people in San Francisco or in Boston, but other parts of your operation can move to other places, other geographies. And if other companies are doing the same thing, and you're working together on that, in a way that doesn't trip over any antitrust rules, then you can actually get a lot of credit, you can really build goodwill in the community, it can be a terrific place to live, and you'll be able to retain more of your skilled workers for longer.
Well, gentlemen, I'm so proud to call you guys my colleagues. I totally buy into your story. It almost breaks my heart how successful the United States was in most of the 20th century, and we're turning our back on a formula that we know has worked in the past and that will pay for itself ultimately. I hope the message gets out and people buy and read this book and give it to their congressman, and we get to work and we jumpstart America. Thanks very much, guys.
Thank you, Erik.